Recording in progress.
We are live, Your Honor.
Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The special meeting of the City Council will please come to order. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. For those participating via Zoom, when we get to the item that you want to speak on, please use the raise your hand feature and the city clerk will turn on your microphone to speak at the appropriate time. Let the record show that all council members are present with the exception of Mayor Nagy and Council Member Freitas. And I just want to take a moment to extend best wishes to our mayor. Our mayor is not feeling well tonight. It's uncommon for the mayor not to be at a council meeting. He has served this community nobly for 42 years, and I imagine if I know our mayor, he's watching at home, so we extend as a council our best wishes. So Mayor, we miss you, and we hope to see you really soon. City Manager's report. We're going to go over the work session for the 2022-2024 biennial budget, and that's the item on the agenda is tonight is that work study session, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our City Manager, Mr. Benoon.
Yes, good evening, Mr. Vice Mayor, members of the council. This is the first of many public discussions that we will be having in regards to planning for the 2022 through 2024 biennial budget. Tonight, we will focus on the operating budget for the next budget cycle, and during the regular council meeting in 2 weeks, we will discuss the related capital improvement plan. Our staff report this evening consists of 8 distinct sections. I will report on the first 2 items, and Ms. Lee will address the middle 4, and will return to me for the last 2 items. First, I will provide an overview of how the COVID-19 pandemic impacts our budget planning. This includes a brief discussion of the City of Newark ARPA. Second, I will address other items that influence our budget planning, including the utility users tax, labor agreements, Measure GG, and continued expansion of residential construction. Following that report, Finance Director Lee will then address Section 3, which is the next budget cycle. Next, she will discuss economic trends and lead us in a discussion on the economy, including a discussion of rising inflation costs. She will later give a financial update on the city's revenue sources and expenditures. She will also provide the council with an update on the city's 5-year forecast at that time. In Section 6, Director Lee will give a brief update on Calpers, because you can't discuss the budget without discussing Calpers. I will then engage the council in a discussion for budget priorities for the upcoming budget cycle. And lastly, we will conclude with the discussion on the next steps. Let me begin my opening remarks by stating the obvious. The COVID-19 pandemic has impacted and will continue to impact our municipal budget. If you may recall, we sat here 2 years ago and discussed optimistic trajectories of our national, state, and local economies. Staff presented 2 projections, one showcasing a slow and steady expansion of the economy, while the other depicted an economic recession. Little did we know that 1 month later, the pandemic would cause such a considerable amount of fiscal uncertainty. When adopting the 2020 through 2022 biennial budget, the council authorized the use of over $14 million in reserves to balance the budget. That budget also included a hiring freeze on non-essential positions, elimination of non-essential travel and training line items, and substantial reduction of contractual services. The intent was to keep the existing workforce intact and to continue providing services at that time. The financial uncertainty of the pandemic also impacted labor, resulting in the suspension of merit pay for the management group and elimination of a modest 1.5% general salary increase that was scheduled for July 1st of 2020. We'd like to pause for a moment and thank our labor partners for graciously agreeing to eliminating the general salary increase. All of our labor partners, including law enforcement, which is an essential service, acted selflessly by recognizing that the city and our community would face substantial adverse financial impacts, and they elected to do their part. I cannot sincerely thank them enough. As we waded through the fiscal uncertainty caused by the pandemic, it became apparent that revenue projections were not as dire as feared. We experienced a $1.8 million surplus after transfers in fiscal year 2021, and as our tables will show later in the presentation, a $1.9 million surplus after transfers in fiscal year 2022. Ms. Lee will provide more information later in the presentation to explain these surpluses, but they're largely the result of the city receiving revenue greater than anticipated, reimbursements through CARES and ARPA, and citywide staff vacancies. Recognizing that we were faring better than anticipated during this current fiscal year, the council, while acting on staff's recommendation, restored positions that were previously frozen as the result of the pandemic and added new positions, including a crime analyst, an associate engineer, an environmental services manager, an information systems specialist, and a human resources director. Also, I also note that the city received 1/2 of its allocations of funds through the American Rescue Plan Act, which, as we all know, is federal legislation that was enacted last year, allocating $1.9 trillion in economic relief to combat the effects of the pandemic. $350 billion was allocated to state and local governments, including $11.8 million specifically awarded to the city of Newark. Last fall, the council adopted the City of Newark ARPA recovery plan, allocating approximately 40% towards restoration of the city's budget, specifically funding 8 previously frozen positions and restoring some contractual services, with the remaining 60% balance being used to fund specific projects and programs to better serve our community, particularly those members of our community who were hit hardest by the pandemic. These programs include over $1 million towards capital improvements and programming costs related to the Newark Resource Center, $1.5 million towards affordable housing, $1.5 million towards a small business grant program, hundreds of thousands of dollars for small business technical assistance and Chamber of Commerce support, and $1.2 million towards improving our community's broadband infrastructure. I must say that the Newark Recovery Plan is a source of pride for city staff. We truly believe it to be an elegant plan that balances the needs for city services while also providing direct relief and assistance to those community members who are in need. Now that I have provided the 2-year historical context of the pandemic, I'd like to comment on how the pandemic continues to impact our municipal budget. As we sit here today, we can see that the pandemic will continue to impact the planning for our 2022 through 2024 biennial budget in 3 fundamental ways. First, as I mentioned a moment ago, the City of Newark received our 1/2 ARPA funds last summer, and we expect the remaining balance, $5.9 million, this summer. City of Newark ARPA recovery plans allocate the monies for 8 positions. Those are accountant, aquatic activity specialist, community preservation manager, 2 general laborers, human resources technician, plan check engineer, and senior planner. This includes the cost of the salary as well as anticipated benefits. These funds will be used to pay for these positions through the end of calendar year 2024. Receiving $11.9 million in the context of a $60 million operating budget is, from my perspective, truly historic. Without this critical funding, the city would not be in a financial position to provide the needed services at the service level that we've all been accustomed to. The goal and intent is to use these funds for the next few years to pay for these essential positions with the expectation that the economy will continue to grow and expand. The cost for these positions will be absorbed by the 2024 through 26 biennial budget in subsequent years. The second manner in which the pandemic fundamentally impacts our budget planning is in regards to the receipt of tax revenue. Specifically, the city has seen, and will likely to see for the foreseeable future, substantially lower revenue than what we were anticipating to receive prior to the pandemic for the transient occupancy tax. This is otherwise known as the TOT, more popularly known as the hotel tax. As Director Lee will show later in the presentation, prior to the pandemic, the city was expecting to receive almost $7 million in TOT by the end of fiscal year 2020. In stark contrast, the city received $2.9 million in fiscal year 21, and we anticipate receiving $3.7 million in fiscal year 2022. Not only are these amounts substantially lower than what we were receiving prior to the pandemic, but to put the matter in perspective, the loss here is nearly equivalent to our UUT revenue, which, as we all know, has been a much-needed revenue source that allows us to provide essential services to our community. At the next council meeting, council will receive a report from economic development staff that will, in part, explain efforts that the city can undertake to promote hotel stays in Newark in an effort to increase TOT revenue. The third manner in which the pandemic impacts our budget is the charge for services revenue, which includes charges for recreation services. The 2020 through 2022 biennial budget contained optimistic projections showing attendance at our recreational amenities would return to pre-pandemic levels during the second half of this budget cycle. Unfortunately, that did not bear out as we continue to see less attendees at our amenities, but I suspect this trend will not last much longer. Before I move off this topic, I'd like to provide a brief disclaimer. No one knows with certainty how this pandemic will end, nor can we definitively state the extent to which this pandemic will impact our economy. However, scientists are cautiously optimistic that we will transition to an endemic stage, hopefully later this year. The Omicron variant is declining as fast as it rose. Face mask orders are being lifted at national, state, and local levels. Large companies are ordering employees to return to work, and schools have returned to in-person instruction. It certainly does appear that the worst is behind us. At this point, I'd like to briefly touch on other factors that influence our budget. This includes the national and local economies, PERS costs, labor agreements, and development. I'm going to briefly highlight each one in turn. Director Lee will provide more information later in the report. Let me start with the economy. Typical economic indicators suggest the economy remains relatively strong. Last year, 6.5 million jobs were added throughout the country, and our national economy grew at the rate of 5.7%. The national unemployment rate is the lowest since the start of the pandemic. On the other hand, economists remain concerned about the rise in inflation. In January, the Consumer Price Index, which measures changes in the price of consumer goods, reached 7.5%. That represents the highest annual increase in 40 years. The largest drivers for that increase include increased food costs, energy prices, housing costs, and used car sales prices. While the federal government can introduce measures to combat this inflation, as we sit here today, we cannot say for certain where this will end, but needless to say, we'll be following it very carefully. Also, at the risk of stating the obvious, economic factors may very well change in response to military action taking place in Europe. Indeed, last week we observed the highest increase in gas prices since 2005. On the state level, last fiscal year, California enjoyed a $44.7 billion surplus, which is certainly a sign of our relatively strong economy here in California. Earlier this year, the governor introduced his intended budget for this upcoming fiscal year. The Legislative Analyst Office, otherwise known as the LAO, predicts that this budget will result in a $31 billion surplus. Staff will continue to follow the state's budgetary process and pay attention to the May revise. While politics itself is defined by uncertainty, we cannot imagine that there would be unfunded mandates, passed down to the local level in light of this significant surplus, but nonetheless, we will be following it very closely. These indicators of the strength of the economy affect our municipal budget in the following ways. First, perhaps most dramatically, they can have a significant influence on sales tax revenue. Sales tax revenue in of itself is inherently volatile and can change at any moment. Also, consequences to sales tax are felt immediately, in contrast to property tax revenue with impacts which are not as immediate and provide a reliable and stable source of revenue. Second, the economy can impact the UUT, which again impacts of which are more immediate. Businesses may continue to adjust their operations in response to the pandemic, which could lead to a decline in the UUT. However, on the other hand, increased utility costs would provide commensurate increased revenue. I'm going to go ahead and turn over to PERS. In November of 2021, the Calpers discount rate was lowered from 7.0% to 6.8%. This obviously increases the normal costs, which is essentially the city's ongoing pension costs, and the unfunded liability for the city. Also, I'd like to remind the council, last year the city made a $10 million additional discretionary payment towards that unfunded liability. This resulted in average savings per year of $1 million through fiscal year 2037. That's all I'm going to say about Calpers at this point. Ms. Lee will provide more information later. Another issue that affects our budget is labor agreements. 53% of our expenditures are personnel costs, which includes health care and pension benefit costs. With the exception of our agreement with the Newark Police Officers Association, our labor agreements expire this fiscal year. Staff is engaging our labor partners in that regard. The city's agreement with the NPA expires in June of 2023, and members of that group are due a 1.5% salary increase this July. Staff is currently engaging with our labor partners to discuss the situation, and resulting agreements would obviously impact personnel costs. To the extent those issues are resolved prior to the adoption of the budget, those updated costs would be included in the budget. On the other hand, any agreements that are reached after the adoption of the budget will require budgetary amendments at some point. Another issue that impacts our budget is development. The city continues to experience increases in residential construction. Throughout this budget cycle, to date, we have issued 455 residential certificate of occupancies. In addition, last year, the council approved 319 residential units to be built at New Park Mall, along with the Costco warehouse. This construction activity has had, and will continue to have, positive impact on property tax revenue. As I said a moment ago, that is a reliable and stable source of municipal revenue. While other revenue streams can fluctuate significantly, even in the worst of economic times, property tax does not decrease, merely remains stable. This increase in property tax resulting from construction has sustained the city and has enabled us to continue providing services to our community. To illustrate the point, 10 years ago, the city's property tax revenue was $11.8 million. This year, we anticipate receiving over $26 million. To put this in perspective, the more than doubling of property tax over 10 years is roughly the equivalent of 4 UUT revenue streams. Speaking of the UUT, that tax continues to provide a stable source of revenue, reflecting approximately 5% of the city's overall revenue. Back in November of 2020, Newark voters overwhelmingly passed Measure PP at almost 72%. Anytime a municipality places a tax measure on the ballot, in essence, is a referendum on the city itself and commentary, in my opinion, on the service level residents receive from the city. This very high passage rate, in my opinion, suggests residents have spoken very clearly on how they feel about the city. Either way, I sincerely thank the residents for supporting our community. Measure PP provides approximately $3.2 million per year in general fund revenue, which allows us to balance the budget. That stream is incredibly helpful, particularly in the light of the pandemic. The last issue I'd like to briefly touch on is Measure GG. Back in August of 2019, the city issued debt to pay for the construction costs. In that process, the city rolled in the existing debt of the aquatic facility at the Silliman Center, and the city took advantage of favorable interest rates. Revenue for Measure GG exceeds our bond payments, and at a future council meeting, staff will provide recommendations for use of the excess funds. That concludes my opening comments. Before I turn it over to Ms. Lee, I'd like to briefly touch on the budget preparation process. This preparation process has remained consistent for many years. We start with the existing approved budget for the current budget year. That serves as our baseline. We then assume continuation of existing services and programs. Each department then estimates the projected revenues and expenditures for the 2020 through to 2024 biennial budget cycle, factoring in anticipated increases or decreases in service level demands, proposed staffing changes, supplies and equipment, contractual obligations, and other programs and services that are being recommended to be added or altered. We then present initial recommendations to the council for consideration. Based on that input, comments, and direction we receive from the council, we'll prepare a draft for council review later in the spring and hopefully have a budget adopted in late May or early June. With that in mind, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Ms. Lee, who's going to provide the latest financial updates. Before I do so, I'd like to publicly acknowledge and thank her and her team for their tremendous efforts in putting together tonight's work session. Ms. Lee took the helm of our finance department nearly 2 years ago, on March 16th, 2020 to be exact. To transition to that type of role is by no means an easy task, but it is even more difficult to do so at the start of a pandemic. She continues to excel in her new role, and I thank her for her efforts. I'd also like to publicly acknowledge and thank Ms. Lori Gephardt for assembling tonight's PowerPoint. As you will see in the next part of the presentation, she spent a considerable amount of time on the PowerPoint, and I'm very much appreciative of her efforts. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Director Lee, who will provide us with an overview of the financial trends.
Thank you, City Manager Biennial. Okay. Good evening, Vice Mayor, members of the council. In my segment of the presentation tonight, I'll briefly walk through the budget cycle, review current economic indicators for our financial forecast, and provide a preliminary financial update. The City of Newark budgets on a biannual 2-year basis with a mid-year budget update for each budgeted fiscal year. The budget cycle varies from year to year, and a general timeline is provided on this slide. The City of Newark operates on a fiscal year basis, which starts July 1st and ends June 30th. During this time of the year, city staff develops an operating budget for the next 2 fiscal years, and therefore this budget cycle will be for fiscal year 2023 and 2024. The budget development process typically is about 9 months in duration and will end June 30th when City Council adopts the final budget. Our preliminary estimates reflect the following economic trends. Sorry about that. So we project in fiscal year 2022 that that fiscal year will be ending above trend and with growth. And this is due to replenishment of depleted inventories and ongoing support from monetary policy. Supply chain bottlenecks are beginning to ease, and the flow of goods could soon be back to normal. So global, national, and local issues all could have impacts on our next budget cycle. Concerns in our last budget cycles was tax reform. Good news is that economists have confirmed that there is no material impact in the economy as a whole. The stock market. This is always an indicator we should continuously be monitoring, and as it can be an early indicator of where investors think the economy is headed. If you recall, there was a stock market sell-off in November of 2018, but the market has since bounced back, hit record highs, and more recently plummeted again. The low workforce growth, this is an ongoing concern. We have enough jobs, but we don't have enough workers, especially in the Bay Area. Concerns that we will keep watching for going into this budget cycle, again, will be labor shortages, the lack of workers to fill available jobs, which then constrains companies from expanding. Housing shortages, this is a prerequisite that affects the labor market. This affects the migration rate to California and is what causes the Bay Area housing prices to continuously rise. The pension discount rate updates and the cost management strategies to pay down unfunded liabilities. In a later slide, I will be reviewing some of the Calpers recent updates. And lastly, the geopolitical tensions. So California housing crisis has been a current hot topic, but it has been a developing topic for decades, and unfortunately, there is no easy solution. Simply put, we haven't built enough homes to meet the demands. The supply-demand disparity drives up costs for both renters and the would-be homeowners. So the high housing cost and cost of living is a major reason why California has one of the highest rate of functional poverty. The pandemic has worsened this crisis, and the distress among renters and has also increased dramatically, causing distress on home buyers. And therefore, it makes it very difficult for people to move into the area and be able to find the jobs and stay here. So in regards to unemployment, states reported that 227,000 workers has filed for new unemployment benefits during the week ending March 5th. This is an increase of 11,000 from the previous week. New jobless claims have held at pre-pandemic levels since the end of 2021. In contrast, 1 year ago, over 700,000 workers were initiating new unemployment claims. The latest monthly employment report for February showed unemployment rate at 3.8%. U.S. employers have added 678,000 jobs last month. This is the most since July of 2021. As the employment accelerate in a tight labor market, again, we have enough jobs but not enough workers, especially in the Bay Area due to high rates and high cost of living. Inflation, also known as CPI, this is the overall increase in the prices of goods or services in the economy. Over time, currency loses its value and doesn't have as much purchasing power. Annual inflation rate in the US has accelerated as of yesterday to 7.9%. This is the highest in 40 years. The CPI data will likely show prices have climbed across a broad array of goods and services. This includes hospitality services and restaurants. And this is all while gasoline prices have increased almost 41% from last year. Oil has been topping at $130 per barrel earlier this week. As long as the Ukraine conflict continues, Russian oil will be impaired, and this is likely to keep prices high, according to the oil analysts. CPI could increase again if oil prices were to move sharply higher. For instance, if oil hits $200 per barrel, the CPI could likely be at 9.7% by April. And this is not considering how much oil prices could affect the price of other goods. So the inflation was seen peaking in March, but with the recent developments in Europe, coupled with ongoing supply constraints and strong demand and labor shortages, this will likely keep inflation elevated. As the supply chains heal, inflation should decelerate, but this is all speculative, and so therefore we've maintained an average of 3.2% CPIs in our projections. February's Consumer Price Index is the last important look at inflation before the Federal Reserve officials meet next week. They would need to move forward with its March rate hike and could do several more before the summer. The increase is expected to be between 25 to 50 basis points, and the tightening will eventually slow growth, but not until next year or beyond. Okay, and on this slide, this shows our fiscal year 2022 projected year-end numbers. On June 25th, Council had adopted the current biennial budget, and at the time, staff had anticipated dramatic declines in 3 general fund sources of revenue due to the COVID-19 impacts. 1 being sales tax, 2, transient occupancy tax, and the 3rd being licenses, permits, and fees, which includes the recreation program fees. So in fiscal year 2021, we had amended the budget to be more in line with the actuals. So amendments for fiscal year 2022 budgets will be proposed in the next council meeting as part of a mid-year update. The following table provides the 2022 projections compared with the adopted budget and the fiscal year 2021 actuals. So this pie chart illustrates the city's revenue sources, and I'll speak briefly on the significant tax revenue sources. Property tax is the city's largest revenue source, representing 38% of the general fund revenues, and will be further discussed in the presentation. The city's second most significant revenue source is sales tax, and this represents 28% of all the general fund revenues. Measure GG, the half-cent sales tax that was approved by voters in November of 2016, is included in this total. The sales tax increases the general fund revenues and provides for transfers to the capital and the debt service funds, and this supports our construction costs as well as debt service payments related to the new Civic Center. The transient occupancy tax was our 3rd primary revenue source and followed by UUT. And the UUT was approved by voters in November 2020 and was extended for another 9 years. Okay. Although some of the revenues have been impacted significantly, the overall impact was not as drastic as anticipated when we had adopted the 2020-2022 biennial budget. This is a pie chart showing the expenditures by category. With the personnel expenditures at 50% of our budget, that is the highest category, which is consistent with all other cities. Personnel expenditures include salaries, benefits, and pension. Non-personnel category includes material, supplies, and services, and this makes up 42% of our budget. Our fire contract is also included here, and this This represents 17% of our current budget. The general fund expenditures for fiscal year 2022 are projected to be $65.2 million at the end of fiscal year. And this includes the $5.6 million of the additional discretionary payment that is planned for Calpers. This proposed payment will be the second ADP to payments to Calpers. The projected $65.2 million expenditures for fiscal year 2022 is $5.3 million higher, or 9% above the adopted budget, and this is largely a result of the pension payments. Other variances are projected decreases in the pardon me. I think I have the wrong slide. Okay, pardon me. Other variances are projected decreases in personnel expenditures, and this represents the unfilled positions which we have budgeted for, but they have not yet hit our books. Compared to the fiscal year 2021, all the expenditure categories are projected to be slightly higher as city services are increasing. Notable differences in the Calpers ADP payments, which is $10 million from last fiscal year and currently being planned for 5.6. This here is our 5-year forecast. This is a multi-year financial forecast which provides a long-range financial outlook. The forecast has been updated to provide the actual activity for fiscal year 2021 and the projected actuals for fiscal year 2022. The estimates for fiscal year 2023 through 2027 were calculated using the average overall 3% CPI. With the exception of the fire contract. The fire contract is currently projected to increase about 4.7%. The general fund could be additionally impacted by losses of revenues and demands for services in other operating funds. For example, ARPA-funded expenditures are appropriated, but the ARPA funding will be exhausted in December of 2024. And therefore, those expenditures will have to be absorbed by the general fund. Another example would be the capital projects funds. This pays for the CIP projects, but where the activities are accelerating and may require additional fundings, the general fund would be transferring into the CIP reserves. So impacts for future negotiations and bargaining groups or other similar scenarios are not fully known, and therefore they have not been included in the forecasted years. The current inflation rate that we've used for those forecasted numbers are currently the 1.5 of the existing MOU, and the out years, we've matched that to 2.7. That's the rate that Calpers uses to project out their payroll. So in addition to concerns discussed above, the current pandemic has other economic problems with the global and local economy with unknown mandates, and this will dramatically change the projections that are provided tonight. The property tax is one of the largest revenue sources and is currently estimated at $26.3 million, which is $4 million or 14% higher than the adopted budget, and $1.8 million or 7% higher than last fiscal year. The information provided by the Alameda County Assessor indicates that the assessed value for fiscal year 2022 tax roll for Newark has increased a net of 5.5%. which is slightly higher than the county-wide increase of 4.7%. This 5.5% increase reflects the growth in the secured assessed valuation and a decline in the unsecured assessed valuation. This is coupled with a slight increase of the motor vehicle and lieu fee. These are the backflow payments from the county. Increases in assessed values are often related to changes in ownership as well as new development. Home prices increased in the second half of 2020 and were reflected in the fiscal year 2022 tax rolls. Sale prices grew due to low inventory and low mortgage rates. These conditions have continued to cause prices to rise in 2021, and we'll be monitoring this trend to see how this may change after the Federal Reserve Board meeting on March 16th. In December, the statewide median home price rose to $797,000. This is 11% up from last December, which was $718,000. In January, the median sale price of a detached single-family home in Newark was approximately $1.2 million, trending up 18.1% year over year. The COVID-19 pandemic did not significantly impact the fiscal year 2020 assessed value growth from transfers of ownerships, but the stay-at-home orders, business closures, and other economic impacts did affect the growth. And this was by reducing the annual CPI adjustment from the maximum 2% to 1.036. New construction that was already underway did not see a decline. However, shortages of building materials did affect new constructions that had not started. And this effect will likely continue through the end of fiscal year 2022, and therefore further causing housing affordability throughout California. Sales tax, this constitutes the second largest revenue source and is projected to be $20.7 million and is 34% higher than the adopted budget and 1% over last fiscal year. Of this amount, $5.7 million is Measure GG, the voter-approved half-cent sales tax revenues, and this revenue is earmarked for debt service payments and residual civic center project expenditures. Newark's receipts from July through September were 1.8% below the third sales period in 2020. After reporting modifications, actual sales were up 10.6%. Overall, place of sales collections, which is also known as Bradley Burns, did soar at 18.3% compared to a year ago. The business industry posted solid returns, assisted by equipment sales. Mirroring statewide trends, auto sales were strong. Booming merchandise sales, especially in apparel and jewelry, reflected a return to in-store shopping. Casual dining also skyrocketed 75% as people once again dined out. Similarly, service stations revenue spiked as gas prices has increased and travel propelled. Conversely, the city's share of the county-wide use tax pool allocations dropped 12.3%. However, the pools remain a solid source of revenue as people continue to embrace the convenience of e-commerce. Local 1-cent sales and use tax receipts for sales occurring July through September, again, were 18% higher than the quarter a year ago. These aberrations have been much greater in the last 2 years due to the governor's executive orders, which allowed businesses to defer some of their sales tax payments as a supportive measure during the pandemic. This program has now expired, and the merchant remittance are now more consistent, making cash receipts more reflective. Surprisingly, one of the stronger sectors has been restaurants and hotels. Originally forecasted to take an extended amount of time to recover, the statewide sales tax generated during the summer months exceeded amounts from pre-pandemic of 2019. The receipts from general consumer goods also marked a steady recovery, and this was led by apparel retailers, jewelries, electronic, and specialty outlets. Gains from the countywide tax pools, however, did slow. And this has been compared to the boost that we were receiving from the imposed AB 147 online retailers. But all things considered, this is still a positive economic trend for our sales tax. Although the car dealers had expressed concerns about inventory shortages due to the supply chains, The sale of new and used vehicles still posted solid gains regardless. Higher property values and good weather contributed to strong building materials and contractor returns. As commuting workers and travelers returned to the road, increased gas prices and fuel service stations also experienced a dramatic recovery, adding to an overall growth that we can expect through the end of 2022's calendar year. The transient occupancy tax revenue has been severely impacted by the COVID-19 pandemic with health orders, travel restrictions, and COVID-19 concerns leading to significant declines in the tourism and hospitality industries. This impact was anticipated during the budget planning process, in which staff did project significant decreases. The TOT revenues are projected to be $3.9 million at the end of fiscal year 2022. This is a $1 million or 56% higher than the adopted budget and almost $1 million or 33% higher compared to last fiscal year. With the increased tourism, hotel occupancy resulting from improvements of the COVID-19 infection rate appears to be trending more positively. Meanwhile, finance team is partnering up with the economic development team and the hotel consultants to better understand the current hotel market with the goal of including opportunities and working with nearby companies The city imposes a UUT on the use of cable, electric, gas, wireless telecom services at the rate of 3.25. The UUT generates about 5% of the general fund revenues. Fiscal year 2021 UUT revenues were $3.4 million, and this year the city is conservatively projecting to receive $3.3 million. The existing UUT was set to expire at the end of the calendar year 2020. However, Newark voters approved the extension. A full year of UUT will be adjusted as part of the mid-year amendments. In terms of other taxes, this category includes property tax, property transfer tax, and business license tax. The other taxes category is projected to be $732,000 and $1.6 million respectively at the end of fiscal year 2022. This totals a $2.3 million and $800,000 higher than fiscal year 2022 adopted budget. And this is a $200,000 increase from the prior fiscal year. Fines and forfeitures consist of municipal code violations, parking citations, and vehicle code fines. This revenue is somewhat unpredictable, and over the years, the amount of money generated from these violations has decreased due to the change in distribution methodology from the state of California. The current year-end projection of $540,000 is still below the adopted budget, but slightly higher than the fiscal year. The licenses, permits, and fees category is projected to end the year at $10.5 million. This is a $1.1 million decrease from the adopted budget, but slightly higher than fiscal year 2021. The category includes franchise fees, recreation charges for services, animal license, construction permits, encroachment permits, and building permits. For the most part, development activity is steady, but expected to level off as large development projects will be completed in the future. Public works services and building permits will remain consistent with prior year amounts due to community needs. General fund reserves and unallocated fund balances at the end of fiscal year 2021 were well above the minimum levels according to our policy. The minimum levels of 15% and 10% of final operating expenditures for the emergency reserve and the fiscal uncertainty reserve, respectively, are at $11.4 million, and the emergency reserve is at 17.4% of the 2021 final operating expenditures. The fiscal uncertainty reserve is at $10.7 million, which is 16.3% of the final expenditures. The pension and OPEB reserve fund started out with $16.8 million and was left with $6.8 after the first ADP payment made to Calpers in June. So the pension funded status in June of 2021, the city had made its first additional discretionary payment of $10 million, and this was to pay down the unfunded accrued liability. This resulted in an average savings per year of $1.06 million through fiscal year 2037. This payment was funded from their pension reserve fund, which was created in February of 2017 for the purpose of setting aside funds to address the unfunded liability. Shortly after that, Calpers had reported the June 30th, 21 investment returns was a 21.3 gain for the year, decreasing the city's projected UAL, but also triggering the risk mitigation policy, which lowered the discount rate to 6.8. This becomes effective and will hit our books in fiscal year 2024. As explained by Calpers, this risk mitigation policy lowers the discount rate in years of good investment returns, resulting in lower investment volatility over time. And this is to provide greater predictability and less volatility in contribution rates for the employers. The effect of the discount rate reduction is a projected increase to the UAL and an increase to our normal costs, which will be effective in fiscal year 2024. At the end of fiscal year 2022, another ADP of $5.6 million will be planned and will be taken to council for their consideration. This second payment of the $5.6 to Calpers would further reduce the UAL and increase the city's funded ratio. Leading up to the discount rate decision, the Calpers asset liability management process is an integrated review of assets and liabilities to achieve a sound and sustainable fund. The goal is to balance the expected cost of future pension payments with the expected future investment returns. This is a formal process that runs on a 4-year cycle and includes a review of Calpers' investment portfolios and retirement plan liabilities. The ALM review starts and is conducted every 4 years. This involves, As mentioned previously, the 21.3 return for the 2021 triggered a funding risk mitigation policy that lowered the discount rate to 6.8. When a discount rate is lowered, this will evidently increase the city's contribution towards employees' pension reserves or pension accounts. This is a year-end summary of where we had projected fiscal year 2022. The city's major revenue sources, again, in fiscal year 2022 are higher than initially forecasted when we approved the budget back in 2020. Property tax and sales tax, representing the two largest sources of revenue for the city, are projected to be $3.3 million and $5.2 million respectively. This is more favorable than the 2022 adopted budget amounts. In addition, the fiscal year 2022 adopted budget excluded $3.3 million of UUT revenue, which at the time was scheduled to sunset. Total expenditures are projected to be $5.3 million higher than the fiscal year 2022 adopted budget, largely reflecting the second planned ADP to Calpers in the amount of $5.7 million. Since the onset of the pandemic back in March, we've started to experience gradual recovery, but staff will continue conservative fiscal planning efforts, and we must closely monitor the following revenue sources: sales tax, UUT, TOT, and charges for services. That concludes my presentation tonight.
All right. Mr. Vice Mayor, members of the council, I think staff's presented a fair amount of information to the council this evening. I thank Ms. Lee for her presentation. The next portion of the presentation is an overview of department objectives and priorities for the next budget cycle. But I think given the amount of information we presented to the council, perhaps it makes sense to take a pause. Ms. Lee and I would be happy to answer any questions that the council may have at this time.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Benoon. Thank you, Ms. Lee. Before I turn it over to my colleagues, is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak or have questions regarding the first portion of this work session? Ms. Harrington, are there any requests, emails, or folks on Zoom that would have questions regarding the first portion of the presentation?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you. Okay, so now I'll turn it over to my colleagues. There was quite a bit of information that was provided. Let's start with Councilmember Collazo.
Thank you. So I'm a little bit confused on how we project the growth of like property taxes with the values of these homes going up so high. Somebody that bought their home here in 1970 for maybe $80,000 and is now selling it for 1.2. Well, it's valued at 1.2, but houses are going for $2 million. You know, so they sell their house here, move somewhere else, buy a home for them and a home for their child in another state. And who's going to be able to afford our houses? Number one, that house might be vacant for I don't know how long. And it's so confusing to me how we can project the growth of the values of the taxes that are going to be coming in. I mean, I think I need a little bit of clarifying on even like our sales tax. Right now, prices have doubled on some of our items, and he who has the wealth to buy it, okay, but my people out there, they're struggling. So if they're not buying anything, we're not going to have any sales tax coming in, except for that one or two rich families in town that are going to be able to afford everything. You know, so what's going to happen to our economy here in the city? But you know, I'm worried. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Mr. Benoon, comments on Councilmember Collazo's statements?
And to think I used to work the AV system here, amazing. I think a few comments. I think first with respect to home purchases and is there any end in this? And I think, council member, you bring up a very valid point. Home prices have increased exponentially, and there's a fair amount of new buyers coming in, and that's in turn driving up the prices of these homes. I think it's, from our perspective, I think it's an issue of simply supply and demand. There's very high supply for housing, and there's very there's very high demand for housing, and not enough supply to meet that demand, and that in turn is really what's driving this. I think in terms of how property tax is projected out to the future, Ms. Lee would be more than happy to provide a detailed answer, but essentially involves looking at past projections, taking a look over typical year-over-year growth. Council member, you're absolutely correct. People, when they sell their homes, That property tax value base is reset, and then the government, local, city and county, get that increased property tax valuation. So we factor that in it as well. We look at new construction, both residential and commercial, and we come in with what we perceive to be the best estimate as we sit here today. Ms. Lee does work in consultation with the county assessor's office in looking at those valuations. Before we jump over, I think you also had some comments about sales tax. But before we jump over to sales tax, Ms. Lee, did you have anything to add about property tax?
Yes, so the property taxes, it's based on the excess valuation, and every year the county provides us with a CPI, and that CPI amount could be a maximum of 2% based off of Prop 13. So in my report, for fiscal year 2022, the CPI was actually reduced to 1.036. And what that means is for $1, instead of being able to tax 2% of that dollar, we were only allowed to tax 1.06. And then from that taxed amount, the city gets a percentage that's calculated from the county assessor's office. And then that amount gets remitted to the city.
Councilmember Bucci.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. Fong Law can explain that to us really well. So he's our county assessor, and he's a great resource for that. Actually, he's very knowledgeable and likes to sit down with other electeds and kind of go through it with you. So I certainly recommend that. We had a mix of good and bad news. I'm glad to see some of the projections from and some of the doom and gloom from the beginning of the pandemic didn't necessarily come to fruition. And I certainly echo our city manager's statement and thoughts on our labor pools that agreed to stand down and set aside some of those salary increases. That was a big deal, especially at the time. So, thank you to everybody for that. I do have a couple questions. One, with the advent of Zoom and obviously less travel and things and kind of a pivot in a lot of corporate behaviors, can we really ever expect the TOT to go back to pre-pandemic levels, or is at this point we're just going to have to assume that we're going to be at a lower level moving forward?
Well, I think Ms. Lee's projection does show a steady increase in TOT. I think a couple of comments. I think one, when we sat here 2 years ago, we certainly had that doom and gloom, that this is the end of TOT and a meaningful contribution to our city's revenue stream. Luckily, that did not bear out. We saw TOT higher than we had projected, which is a sign to us that it's not necessarily doom and gloom. I think long-term, it will certainly take a fair amount of time to recover. At the end of the day, we certainly cannot project with absolute certainty where this is going, but as we sit here today, based off the information we have, that's what we anticipate going forward. We are working with economic development staff to undertake efforts to increase that TOT. Obviously, we'd like to continue increasing that as much as we possibly can. Prior to the pandemic, I sat through, I don't know how many budget presentations where the then ASD said over and over, this number will level out. And it just never did. It continued to increase year over year over year over year. And I think, again, putting aside the absolute uncertainty that is in front of us, all we can do is project as we sit here today that increase, and that's how we see it. As you can see from that projections, we don't have it getting back to where it was prior to the pandemic in the foreseeable future, and that includes that 5-year forecast. So, Ms. Lee, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yes, so the increase was mainly due to the tourism travels. The actual business travel is what's still holding back the TOT revenues and causing that lag.
And do we think that that's going to change, or do we think that, my understanding from even, my personal experience is we're not traveling as much, and we've cut back on a lot of trips, and a lot of things have gone remote and virtual. So it's just something to think about. I think that impact's going to be there a lot longer than a 1-year bounce back. So, yep. And we love our hotel taxes. In our pension reserve fund, I know we have another payment coming up, but I was just wondering, if we still have a fair amount of capital in there that's collecting some sort of interest, and what the fund might be at right now.
We currently have 6.8 million, and in terms of interest, we have our money in life, and therefore it's not earning a lot of interest. Staff would like to come back to council to look at other strategies to put that money to use, and a recommendation that staff is looking into is to set up a pension 115 trust. And we're hoping that instead of having it sit in LAIF, which is earning less than 1%, the average 10-year return is about 6 to 9% on that.
That'd be great. That's like the same as our discount rate. I guess just one last thing before we move on, and it was kind of just a tag on to what Councilmember Collazo said. You know, pre-pandemic, the Bay Area 9 counties added about 50,000 jobs, but all of our cities combined only built about 12,000 houses. So when you talk about stock shortage and, you know, a desire to move here, obviously people are coming into the region, but we're not preparing for them. I would say with the exception of us in Dublin, many cities have fallen short of the mark. And one, that's part of the reason why we've tried to add to the housing stock to help ease the tension and give some Newark folks some opportunity. Obviously, the prices continue to rise, which is a challenge. But you know, we have some cities that use things like mountain lions and habitats, you know, to get out of building homes and things. And you know, I would also double down and say that's why some of these affordable housing projects that we're looking at are so important, and why it's good to have an array of low-income affordable housing, workforce housing, senior housing, and you know, we're really looking at it comprehensively with our housing plan. So I don't think people realize the string that ties all these things together, whether it's the schools or whether it's traffic and a host of other issues, that all the common thread through all of them is housing and the cost of living here, and how difficult it can be. So I certainly, you know, want to encourage our other counterparts in other cities to do their part and, you know, step up on some of their planning, because a lot of them are falling short and it's affecting all of us. So, yeah, shout out to us and to Dublin. So, thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, colleagues. Couple comments, and I certainly want to echo my colleagues' comments, especially living in this area, just the incredible cost it is to our residents and how challenging it's going to be for them moving forward on the purchase of goods or housing. And congratulations to the city of Newark for really looking closely at affordable housing in our community and how we can make an impact in that area. Before I get to my questions, Mr. Benoon, I just want to take a couple moments to really thank the people that put us in this, what I really believe to be a good situation. When we were looking at a significant budget deficit a couple years ago, there's a number of people that we really need to thank. And Councilmember Bucci mentioned our employees in this organization. They recognize that we're in this economic situation together, and they were willing to forego pay raises to help contribute to our economic situation. So I also, with Councilmember Bucci, want to thank our employees. I want to thank our residents. We came forward with some tax measures that in most communities would go down to a flaming defeat, but we not only were successful with those tax increases, they were overwhelmingly supported by our residents. And I think, Mr. Benoon, your comment as to the fiduciary responsibility that we've taken hold of as a council of the last few years has given our residents confidence that the decisions that we're making are the right decisions. And then finally, I want to thank staff. Budget process, I think, Ms. Lee, you mentioned it's a 9-month process. I imagine, Ms. Lee and Mr. Benoon, you're thinking about that 12 months out of the year. It's just an ongoing situation. You know, you give a 5-year forecast or 3-year forecast, things can change. You saw the inflationary rate, as Ms. Lee mentioned, is 7.9% today, the highest in over 40 years. Nobody anticipated that if you went back a year or two. So outstanding job by the staff to kind of foresee where we were going as a city and making sure that we were positioned in such a way that we were going to survive this. So congratulations in that regard. Just a few questions, Mr. Benoon. You mentioned a number of positions that we are filling and will be filling. Once those positions are filled, do you have an estimate as to the number of vacancies that we still will need to fill over the next 1 year, for example? And an estimate is just fine.
So once these positions are added and filled, our FTE count will be 165-ish. The vacancy rate we're experiencing now is about normal of what we've experienced, around 12%, give or take a couple percent throughout the year. So it is definitely a candidates market out there. So we are trying to come up with recruitment and retention strategies that will attract people here and keep them here. So I think with those efforts, I don't anticipate that number to change much in the next year.
Yeah, in hiring staff, if you just show them a city council meeting and how we work so well together, if that's not an enticement to come work here, I'm not sure what else is going to help. And then, of course, there's no greater responsibility that we have as a community than public safety. And so I know you talked about vacancies in our employee groups. Could you just describe briefly where we are at in terms of, and I know it's an ever-changing prospect because folks retire and things of that nature, but how close are we to where we are comfortable with full staffing in our police department, for example?
Hopefully the chief will agree with me here. We are luckily fully staffed in our police dispatch center with, I think, a lot of police departments can say. The police department, actually, you'll see in the department priorities ahead of us, is actually reforming a team they had formed just before COVID to focus on how they can come up with creative solutions to attracting more police officers. So I would definitely say we do not have a higher vacancy rate than many of the police departments out there. A lot of times the vacancies are due to these long-term leaves, due to injuries and things that make it appear that we have more vacancies than we actually do. But I think through attrition, retirements that are coming up, that the vacancy rate will not, again, change much, and that the police department are being very proactive in their efforts to make sure that they are attracting police officers. And human resources just recently evidence that we really try to work hard together to make the process move faster when we are competing with other agencies for those lateral officers. And so we'll continue to do that as well.
We have an outstanding police department. We have an outstanding fire department. Our public safety know that they have the support of this city council when it comes to recognizing the importance of the services that they provide to this community. And so hopefully, Chief, that will make recruitment of other officers down the road or getting outstanding officers from other organizations to come over here easier. So continue in that effort. We talked about sales tax, and one of the big sales tax opportunities that we have coming into Newark, and you mentioned it, Mr. Benoon, is Costco. Do we have an anticipated opening for Costco when we might anticipate that those sales tax dollars might be coming into the city? And Ms. Lee, did you factor in Costco in terms of sales tax revenue or not at this point?
Not yet.
Yeah.
I did not.
We council members are looking to spend that money before we even have it. Any ideas when Costco? Go ahead, sir.
When the council entitled this project, the project timeline at that time was hopefully that Costco would be open by the winter holiday shopping season of this calendar year. Staff was going to check into that in the next week or two to obtain an update on both the Costco side as well as the residential construction side.
Thank you. A couple minor questions, Mr. Lee, and again, thank you for the thorough report. You mentioned the Federal Reserve, and they may raise rates in the next month or two, and you mentioned its impact on property taxes. Is that because you would anticipate mortgage rates will go up, which may then impact the number of sales that occur in a community?
Yes and no. It's mainly the impact will be more on the blockchain supplies, being able to have the inventory built, and therefore we would have less of the actual transactions. It would just be the annual 2% that would be assessed.
And then on the TOT, which has been a significant revenue generator for the city, I know we periodically will see, Mr. Benoon, a percentage of our hotel rooms that are occupied at any given time. Do you have a rough estimate as to how many of our hotel rooms, for example, in the last 30 days were occupied? Do you have a sense as to that figure?
I don't have that information off the top of my head, but I suspect our economic development manager, Ms. Stedler, who's very much on top of the situation, may have that at the tip of her, I may have it at her fingertips.
At this time, it's fairly solid between 60 and 70%.
Thank you. So I'll represent to the community that what staff has mentioned, that we're in the area of 60 to 70%, and I would anticipate, based on Ms. Lee's presentation, that we anticipate that that percentage will grow over the next few years, and that's great news. Ms. Lee, you mentioned the, this is my last question, you mentioned the emergency reserve funds. Could you go back to that slide real quickly? I just want to make sure I understood it, where you showed, I believe, 17.4 million and 16.3 million. And I believe what you indicated that our goal is to maintain that at about a 15%, level. Did I understand that correctly?
Yes.
So do we, as I look at the numbers that you've provided here, and maybe I'm doing the math incorrectly, it looks like we are at, what millions of dollars then are we over that 15%? Is that here on this chart?
It is not on the chart, but I do have those numbers.
And my question as to that is as I would imagine, since we want to maintain that 15%, do we have those excess funds earmarked anywhere specifically?
They're currently sitting in the general fund, but they are earmarked for each one of these general funds separately. So what we're saying is that the policy, there's a minimum of 15 and 10%, and because it's based off of our actual expenditures, and so our expenditures were really low due to the pandemic, and so we kept them at the same level, closer to the baseline calculation, and therefore we didn't reduce it this year.
Thank you, Mr. Benoon, and certainly, colleagues, there'll be other opportunities to ask questions on the first part of the presentation, but let's go ahead and go on to the second part.
All right, Ms. Lee, if you could go ahead and move the PowerPoint along. At this point, we're going to go ahead and discuss the upcoming department policies and objectives that we want to accomplish in this upcoming fiscal year. So it's broken down by department. We're going to go ahead and start with public safety. We'll start with our police department. We have two slides on this department, one being the operations division and the other one being support services division. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Chief Anderson for her leadership in the department. As far as operations, one policy objective and priorities: to recruit and train the new crime analyst. This new position, we've never held this position here in the city of Newark, would analyze data on crime reports and provide recommendations as to where officers should be assigned in order to be more effective in addressing property crimes and other matters. And this is an initiative that brought forward by Chief Anderson, and again, I thank her for her leadership in that regard. Another operations initiative is to address complaints for vehicles, this is unregistered and non-operating vehicles on both public and private property. And finally, to train our officers using less lethal devices, as well as technologies to facilitate de-escalation strategies. So that's on the operations side. On the support services side, we'd like to expand the number of residents and businesses currently opted in to AC Alert. This is a mass notification system that was put forward by the county a few years ago, as well as the evacuation platform, that's Zone Haven. That's the new platform that we engaged about a year or two ago. Second thing is to explore new ways to increase the number of candidates for entry-level police officer positions. I think Mr. Vice Mayor, you had the question about vacancies for our officers. We're at fully staffed on dispatch, which is great news, but we are down 8 officers at this point Again, I thank the police department and HR staff for coming up with ways to address those vacancies. It's a very tough and competitive market, but we certainly take an aggressive and proactive approach, as evidenced by last week. Third, prioritize professional development and succession planning. This includes adopting an acting sergeant in training program. This is a relatively new concept for us, as well as ensure current practices are consistent with department policy through a policy compliance audit. Moving over to Alameda County Fire Department, that department will continue to meet the delivery obligations for emergency response times. Those are outlined in the existing agreement that the city has with the Alameda County Fire Department. They're going to go ahead and collaborate with us to provide emergency preparedness training. If the council may recall, a year or two ago, the city entered into an MOU with Union City to share an emergency preparedness coordinator. That gentleman is Mr. Rich Martinez. He will work in collaboration with ACFD and continue furthering these programs. This includes the LISTOS, PEP, which is Personal Emergency Preparedness, CERT, Newark residents, and we will take a look at the city's comprehensive emergency management plan and local hazardous mitigation plan. Those documents were adopted 6-7 years ago, and it's time to revisit those. Moving on, next department I'd like to talk about is Public Works. Generally consists of 3 divisions. We did add on Environmental Services Manager. We'll get to that in a moment. So I'm going to start with engineering. The first objective is to support residential and commercial construction. We have a lot of projects going on, and our engineers are busy behind the scenes working on those, and I thank them for their efforts. Oversee construction of the Central Avenue Overpass, and this is exciting. We hope to start construction in the summer of 2023. Will largely depend on all the utility relocation, including a significant amount of coordination with PG&E. Another project is to complete the Lakeshore Park Landscape Restoration Project, hopefully later this year. And the fourth item is to complete a citywide facilities master plan. And this would be essentially an analysis of the city's existing buildings. We have a lot of aging infrastructure, obviously outside the Civic Center complex. And we will need to take a look at those facilities and determine the needs of Newark community going forward, as well as the capability and capacity of those facilities to meet those needs. And then last but not least, the Railroad Quiet Zone Study. Council authorized a contract, I believe it was a couple months ago, and we hope to have more information and a final report later this year. So that's on the engineering side. On building inspections, they will continue to support residential and commercial construction, explore options for electronic or paperless permit processing. They'll evaluate the existing permit tracking software and internal processes in hopes of addressing permit review streamlining. And then the third division we have is maintenance. Maintain all the city's landscaping, parks and streets, public buildings, equipment assets, explore opportunities to improve service levels, invest in more efficient equipment and advanced technology, maintain and improve the city's urban forest, emphasizing street, tree, and park safety for our community. And of course, we'll identify opportunities for improving safety conditions for all our streets, parks, and buildings. And last but not least, in Public Works, implement the city's stormwater program in coordination with regional partners, work with franchise hauler on garbage-related issues. In fact, I should take a step back. The council may recall, council authorized the creation of Environmental Services Manager. That position has since been filled. The gentleman started last month. He's here with us this evening, and he will be properly and formally introduced at an upcoming council meeting. So he has a fair amount of work in front of him, as you can see here. One of which will be the franchise hauler. So that contract with Republic Services expires in May, I believe, of 2023. He'll be busy addressing that issue. We also have considerable amount of state mandated requirements to divert solid waste from landfills. This is what we also lovingly refer to as SB 1383. We will implement water conservation efforts in partnership with ACWD to address the ongoing drought. And we will research opportunities for collaborative efforts to address climate protection measures. So that's Public Works, and I would be remiss if I failed to mention it's led by our Public Works Director, Mr. Soren Fajot, who's been with the city for quite a while of time, and we thank him for his service. The next department is Community Development. This consists of 3 divisions. We'll start off with planning. It's led by our Community Development Director, Mr. Stephen Turner, who's here with us this evening. Implement specific plans for areas 3 and 4, Old Town, Bayside, Newark, New Park Mall. The second column there, updating the housing element and environmental hazards element of the general plan. So if the council may recall, we held a joint session with the Planning Commission to start off this process last fall. Went over really well, received some feedback and direction. Well, Mr. Turner's busy and putting together a website with our consultant. Hopefully this website will be released to the public next week. It outlines the upcoming housing element project, and Mr. Turner's busy engaging with the community, meeting with various community groups to discuss the housing needs of our community, and I thank him for his work. And then the last column there, very exciting. We will be implementing the Affordable Housing Work Plan in this budget cycle. We do have that one housing project we're working on. But in addition to that, we have a lot of exciting projects coming up. Potentially next month, our staff will issue a notice of funding availability, otherwise known as a NOFA, to various housing providers. We have about $12 or $13 million, if the council may recall, that's allocated to that portion of the Affordable Housing Work Plan. So very exciting times, and I thank him for his work. Moving on to economic development, we'll continue to attract new businesses, including retail, hotel, high technology businesses, and employment. Continue to market Newark to businesses and real estate brokers, and use ARPA funds to support the Chamber of Commerce and small businesses. And as I said at the start of this presentation, in 2 weeks, Ms. Stedler will come back and provide the council with a comprehensive update on economic development activities, and it will be a great detailed presentation, and we look forward to receiving that. The next division is the Community Preservation Division. If the council may recall, using ARPA funds to fund the Community Preservation Division Manager, that position was frozen as a result of the pandemic. An important goal of the city is to expand and revitalize our city's community preservation program, and with the hopes that the new Community Preservation Division Manager will certainly lead that charge. I believe the gentleman started this week. I have not had the pleasure of meeting him, but I am deducing it is the gentleman sitting next to our Deputy Community Development Director, and I look forward to working with him in expanding and revitalizing our community preservation program. We'll analyze and implement new strategies and procedures to revisit the city's existing ordinances, and we'll utilize appropriate aggressive enforcement methods whenever it is necessary in order to achieve public safety and preserve our community, and that will include utilization of any receiverships and any other legal remedies. That's our Community Development Division. Moving on to Recreation and Community Services. It's an exciting time. We have the development of programming at the Newark Resource Center. As I said earlier, with the ARPA funds, we plan on repurposing the former Head Start facility into a resource center. We expanded programming staff with Promus Taurus. We look forward to bringing this project forward, hopefully later this year. It will require some effort from Public Works, as well as some new programming and innovative programming from our Promus Taurus group and community services staff, and I thank them for all the work that they will do in the ensuing months. Establish partnerships to offer human services there. We'll work in collaboration with the Family Resource Center over in Fremont, as well as 2-in-1 of Alameda County. We'll continue to provide community special events and recreation opportunities, including Family Day at the Park, I believe is scheduled for Saturday, April 6th. Just a plug in for that. We'll also continue to offer scholarships, recreational and fitness opportunities. We have expanded financial capacity to do so in light of the ARPA funds, and we're truly excited about that, as well as offer empowering leadership and educational programs. So that's our Recreation and Community Services Department. On the financial side of things, as always, we will continue to monitor and evaluate the city's revenues, national and state economies, fiscal policies, as well as any other economic trends. Continue to develop the budget along with the 5-year forecast. We'll monitor our spending very carefully and advise the council of any necessary budget amendments. Provide leadership in the development, implementation of financial policies. We'll continue with the ERP there. That is the Enterprise Resource Planning tool. It's a very robust program that we use for financial purposes. We previously relied on Wintegrate. It's 24 years old. It's quite a big endeavor to replace that. I thank Ms. Lee and IT staff for their tremendous work. But we still have a couple modules left, and we'll work on those in the next budget cycle. That includes the human resources and asset management modules for that system. And that concludes our finance department. Again, I thank Ms. Lee for her leadership. Human Resources, being led by our new Human Resources Director, Ms. Jennifer Salito. This is, I believe, month 2, started earlier this week. We'll continue to develop innovative measures to attract and retain a talented workforce, implement professional development opportunities to enhance employee success, ensure departments have all the tools and resources necessary to ensure we have timely, accurate, and relevant performance evaluations, continue to support employee wellness and safety. We do have a wellness committee as well as a risk management committee comprised of various staff members from different divisions and departments. And something new, the Human Resources Department will be responsible for limiting liability, and Ms. Salito will serve as the city's delegate to the city's general liability JPA, which is the plan. So, information systems, led by our assistant city manager. She's made a lot of progress the past 2 years, a lot of updates to technology, and I thank her for her work. We'll continue to implement the strategic framework plan. If the council may recall, this is something that we adopted about a year or so ago, a little over a year. A fair amount of work to be done, and they'll be busy implementing that. Continue to focus on customer-focused technology solutions, anticipating the city's current and future needs. Develop information technology business continuity and disaster recovery plan. This is obviously in response to cyber warfare threats. This will allow us to recover technologies in the event there is some sort of major disaster. As well as IS will support other department initiatives to enhance customer service, which is something we'll always be doing. So that's our IS division. And I think last but not least, the city manager's office, consisting of the city manager, city clerk, and city attorney, will be responsible for the overall implementation of the City of Newark ARPA recovery plan, as well as implement any city council priorities and projects. We do have an upcoming municipal election later this year. I thank the city clerk for her work later this year. And we will continue with all of the community engagement and outreach platforms that we are looking into. If the council may recall, council allocated some ARPA funds to use new technology to engage our community, and we look forward to reviewing that and bringing that project forward in the next budget cycle. So that concludes, I believe, all of the department objectives and priorities. As far as next steps, in 2 weeks, so 2 weeks from tonight, Mr. Jason Imai, the city's assistant city engineer, will provide us with an update on capital improvement plan. Staff will continue to work on drafting the biennial budget. Hope to have an updated budget work session, updated financial information later in May, along with a draft budget, and that includes draft CIP. And then hopefully that will lead to budget adoption either at the end of May, and if not that, then more likely June. So those are the next steps. I'd be happy to answer any questions that the council may have, as well as any department head and our finance director as well.
Thank you, Mr. Benoon. Before I turn it over to my colleagues for questions, is there anybody in the audience that would like to speak on the second part of the presentation? Now, see, in San Jose, where I used to work, this is where all the department heads would be running up to the podium to position themselves for budget increases. City Clerk Harrington, are there any requests online to speak on this?
There are not, Your Honor.
Thank you. Council comments. Councilmember Collazo.
Thank you. So I have just 3 or 4 questions here. I just saw something that said there were some changes to the ARPA funds, the way that you could spend the funds. Is that going to affect us in any of the decisions that we have previously made?
I don't believe so. Ms. Lee was very much on top of the regulations, as well as Ms. Del Rosario. They carefully review all the updates that are put forth by the federal government. I don't believe any of those updates in any way, shape, or form affect our Newark ARPA recovery plan. And she's shaking her head. Yeah.
Okay. My next question. Our central overpass, why is that taking so long for PG&E to coordinate that one move?
Well, Mr. Vajot, it'd be better to explain the technical side of things, but there is a fair amount of utility relocation work, and we are dealing with Pacific Gas and Electric Company. Mr. Vajot, would you like to?
Yeah,
Yeah. Well,
But it's been years. I mean, it hasn't just been a few months.
That is true, and some of that is on the city's end. We had a bit of a delay ourselves
Okay.
in coordinating with PG&E, but we're back focused with them and have a schedule to get their design completed, and have that preliminary relocation work done in advance of the start of the actual project.
Okay. When you
it's-
have a few minutes, I took some pictures of some overpasses that I want to show you, so
Okay.
we'll do that.
Happy to able to.
Thank you.
Okay.
Another thing is water conservation. So I've been spending a lot of time in Manteca, because I have somebody that I love very much over there that I go see. And their parks all are dipped in so that when it rains, they capture the water, and the underground, I don't know if they're called basins, are filled instead of the water running off into where, and so I thought that was a great idea. I'm not very happy with everything that Manteca does, but that really caught my eye because every park I drive by, every development has the parks, and every park is dipped in, and when it rains, it catches the water, and you can see the water for days until it gets soaked up into their basins that they have underground. So I have one more comment, and it is our Family Resource Center. It is something that is very needed here in our area. We have people that need information all the time, but our promotoras are the ones that are going to be handling this. Our promotoras have been doing a wonderful job ever since they came on board. And I was hoping that we would be able to keep them on full-time instead of part-time before somebody tries to steal them away from us. My two cashiers that I have that are not family keep getting asked at the tortilla factory, how much are they paying you? I'll pay you an extra $1. I don't want that happening with my promotoras. I don't want them leaving the city of Newark. So that's the other comment that I had. Thank you very much.
Councilmember Pucci.
Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor. I'm going to try not to get too far into the weeds, but since we were talking about some priorities and some programs, I did want to ask, and Chief Anderson, since you're here, we had discussed a while back about a catalytic converter program, and I didn't see it on here, and I know that's a big deal right now, so I was just wondering if we were still down a path on that and when we might see something like that come to fruition.
I'm on.
Yeah.
Good evening, Vice Mayor, Councilmember Bucci, Councilmember Collazo. I'm Gina Anderson, your Chief of Police. And, sir, regarding the catalytic converter thefts, we know that is a significant issue, not just in the city of Newark, but in the Alameda County region and state of California as well. So my hope on this is that as soon as we can get our crime analyst hired in Newark and trained, that we can have that person take a more in-depth look at the catalytic converter thefts in our city, and we can better strategize our response to the specific locations because we'll have a better idea what days and times and the trends when those are occurring in Newark. So that is coming. Not that it's not a priority, it just didn't rise to the level of the 4 priorities that we chose to focus on for the budget session.
Sure. Let me ask you this, in having the new analysts and being on top of kind of where some of these things are happening is great, but what about finding some funds, and whether it's through the city or other programs where we can encourage newer residents to go get their VIN numbers etched on to their Cadillacs in partnership with some local shops?
So I am familiar with programs like that. I've been part of programs like that in the past where we go out and oftentimes those are that the services are donated by local people in our community, local shops that want to do those things. And although I don't have that scheduled as something like on the schedule that we're doing in the near future, it's certainly not something that's out of the realm of the possibility for us to do.
Okay. Thank you, Chief. If you need help going from shop to shop and asking for free stuff, I'm your guy.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief. And then, real quick, I had a couple Public Works questions. Mr. Frageau, if you want to come on back up. I didn't realize San Jose had a WWF style of funding and everybody ran to the top, but since I think Mr. Frageau walked up first, he should get some sort of bonus for his department. The Lake Shore Restoration project, is that going to include the bathrooms? Are we expecting those to be opened by the end of the year?
That is not part of the upcoming landscape restoration project. There was some interest in a restroom at Lakeshore Park, and that has been brought up again this year. So when we go through the capital improvement plan for the upcoming biennial budget, we'll bring that project up as a possibility that council can consider funding.
Okay.
There's an opportunity there.
Okay. And then why I have you up here, and I'm not sure if this falls in exactly on you, but I know, and I saw on here some of the online permitting services, and we were trying to start to route some of that through our new web page. Have we been successful at that?
Well, with the pandemic, of course, we were forced to convert over to electronic issuance of permits, and that has been largely successful. Our new chief building official, Matthew Farrell, is here, and he's looking at our process, and we do want to streamline the process, as was mentioned earlier in the program, and have more accessibility through the web for folks that want to obtain permits. So it's a work in progress right now. We're not all the way there, but lots of improvements the last couple of years.
Okay, great. And then my last question for you is the citywide LED lighting upgrades.
Yes.
That's a big deal. It's going to save us a lot of money. It's a little money up front, but in the back end, I mean, it's going to save us tens of thousands of dollars a month.
Yeah, so we had that in the CIP. It was an unfunded project through the last budget cycle, but we're looking at some alternatives that are potentially very little cost up front, actually, for the city to pay over time with the conversion. So we hope to be bringing something up to council here in the next several months, actually, regarding LEDs.
Great.
Separate from the CIP process.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, sir. I appreciate it. And then this is, I suppose, maybe a community development question, and I can ask you as well, Mr. City Manager. Before the pandemic, we talked about instituting some vacancy fees for places like the old Orchard over off of Jarvis that, is unfortunately corporate owned, and I believe they used it as a tax write-off, and that they don't have a real interest in getting that leased out. I know we kind of pulled back on vacancy fees during the pandemic time because it didn't make sense, but I certainly want to keep it on our radar because when it does make sense, I'd like to revisit it.
Sure. I think it's fair to say we're more than happy to do that research, absolutely. But before we go down any further, just like to point out, Ms. Stedler, in 2 weeks, will provide some updated economic development information, and that would include a recommendation for some consultants to better understand the relationships between the various landlords and tenants in that complex. It does get rather intricate with the various agreements that they have, which limits what can go there. But we are very mindful of that vacancy. It is obviously very frustrating for the community as well as city staff. And Ms. Stedler is taking that to heart, and we'll bring back some updated information in 2 weeks.
Okay, thank you. And then the last thing I saw was a mention of some scholarships through the ARPA funds for recreation opportunities. Is that, can you give me more information on that? Are we going to be lowering the entrance rate for kids during the summer, or what are we doing with that?
Sure. We do receive funding from the Newark Betterment Corporation for recreation scholarships. It's up to a certain amount per year per family. We used ARPA funds to remove those limitations. So I believe we're up to $210,000, I believe was the total amount. If you want the specific number of those dollar amounts, I'm more than happy to provide that information to you. Mr. Cuevas, I believe, is appearing via Zoom. He's up in a conference in Sacramento right now. Be happy to provide that information if we can dial him in.
Okay, I was looking for just kind of an overview. If he wants,
sure, it's
available. We can pull him in. I'm sure he's excited to hear that. I think it's a great idea. We love the Silliman Center. You know, I think I saw my earlier. She learned how to swim there. We do swimming and dance there. So if we can expand opportunities for other Newark kids, yeah, that'd be great. Hey, there he is.
Can you guys hear me tonight?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so we are starting our scholarship program. Currently, staff is working on updating all of our materials currently, and so we're hoping to get this program released here within the next month or two. But one of the things that we are looking at doing with the increased scholarship funding through ARPA is we are expanding the access to the program. One of the things that we noticed was a lot of our families have, higher amounts of children. And so we removed our family cap and included it up to now 6 individuals, and also including increasing their limits that they can use their funding. The goal is to make sure that they have enough funds to at least get through 5 swim lesson sessions, because one of the things that our scholarship program was developed for was to increase swimming and drowning awareness in the community. New for this year, we are also going to be adding in all of our scholarship participants will be able to use their funding to apply for an annual season pass for the center to increase healthy lifestyles and access to quality recreation in the community.
That's great. Thank you, Mr. Cuevas.
You're welcome.
And that's it for me. Thank you, Mr. Vice Mayor.
Thank you, Councilmember. Just a couple questions and then more comments than questions. Mr. Benoon, you made reference in your report to a policy compliant audit. Would that be an internal audit conducted by the police staff?
It is yet to be determined at this time. Ideally, we would like to have an external audit performed. It will depend on financial capacity to do that, but staff is reviewing that at this point. At the very minimum, I think it's fair to say that an audit will certainly take place.
I want to commend you, Mr. Benoon, again for bringing on a crime statistic analyst in the police department. When you have limited resources, if we can focus those resources on those parts of our community that are most impacted, as you mentioned, with catalytic converters and other types of crimes that are going on, the more focused we are, the better responsive we can be. To that end, I want to take just a moment to Chief commend Lieutenant Sandoval for his presentation last night. I thought he did an outstanding job to meet with a community, and there were over 100 people there who have a focus on a possible impact for him to identify and describe the crime statistics for that area, to put, I think, a lot of people at ease. You are to be commended, as is the lieutenant, so thank you for his work on that. So pleased that we hired an environmental manager for this organization. You mentioned it, and it didn't gloss over me, Mr. Benoon. Another state mandate sent down to the city, SB 1383, with absolutely no funding tied to it. It's an incredible burden on residents. It's an incredible burden on our business sector. And I just want to take one moment to thank Stop Waste, a county organization that, in my mind, has done a tremendous job of taking really a lot of the load in terms of marketing and information out there to our community. So, again, the state needs to understand they can't continue to pass these mandates when there's no money tied to it. But we preach that every year, and every year they continue to do what they do. Also want to take a moment to thank Community Development. Turner, thought you did an outstanding job last night. Probably one of the most controversial issues that we have faced in this community in the last number of years. A lot of the issues that residents were concerned about were dispelled, and I thought you and your staff did an outstanding job of kind of laying out the framework, what this is, and why it's of benefit to not only Newark, but to our surrounding communities as well. I want to take a moment to thank Ms. Stedler in Economic Development for the outstanding work you did. We went through a 2-year economic crisis in this community where businesses were struggling, and we, the city, came up with grant programs and proposals that, maybe didn't help businesses survive, but maybe some did. And I think it's a result of the work you did, Mr. Benoon, and your staff to let the community know that we're in this together. We care about you as a business, and we want you to survive, and we want you to succeed. So congratulations on that. And to my colleagues' comment on Promotores, such an outstanding organization. We have a segment of our community that is unfamiliar with government, fearful maybe of government, this is an opportunity for them to understand that we, the city, will provide you services. We will put you in contact with folks that can help you navigate government services. And it's a powerful team of, what, 2? And if we can make those folks full-time, because I think it's a real benefit to our community, I would certainly echo my colleagues' comments on that. Councilmember Cuellar?
I just want to add that I don't know a single business that received a grant that has closed. Not that I'm aware of. I don't.
That's outstanding.
Yeah, that's outstanding.
Mr. Benito, I think that's our questions, unless you have any.
I have nothing further to add. It is 6:49, so about a 10-minute intermission.
I told the mayor I'd be done early. I told him. He took bets against me, but I told him we'd be early. So we're going to go ahead and close this work session. Thanks, staff, for all the hard work you did. Ms. Lee, thank you for the work you did in preparing for this. And we will adjourn the council meeting in 10 minutes. Thank you.